Welcome to the Orthocast. Today we have David Patrick Harry, who runs the Church of the Eternal Logos YouTube channel, which is one of the most unique channels on YouTube because he covers so many different topics at an extremely high level. I mean, literally a graduate and PhD level. He talks about philosophy, movies, other religions, theology, masculinity, so many different things and cultures. And so because of that, I send his videos to so many different people because my videos are very kind of surface level, but he offers that next level of depth. And another thing I appreciate is that the reason he covers all these different topics is because he's really offering a holistic worldview of how we approach everything. And while many other groups may get little things right, like the Manosphere may get some things right, he puts it in its proper context in the Orthodox Christian worldview. So thank you so much for your work. Thank you for coming on today. Hopefully this is the first of many collabs.
Well, thanks, Kyle, for having me on. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah. So my first question for you is, a few years ago, you made a video called Your Spiritual Journey Back to Christianity. And that was a really great video. And I had a few questions about it. And maybe for those who don't know, what was your upbringing like? And what have you maybe learned since making that video?
Yeah, so I am from just south of Indianapolis, Indiana. I grew up there, and I grew up in a conservative Methodist home. My dad's side, we go back multiple generations of Methodist ministers. And I kind of took religion for granted growing up. And it was really once I got into college, I began to think I was going to devote my life to Christ at around 19. And I took a course at my undergraduate on the Bible. And I was exposed to a lot of scholastic criticism, looking at the comparisons between the Epic of Gilgamesh and Noah, looking at the multiple author theory of the Gospels, and seeing all these different things really sort of to shake my naive conservative faith. And I really got interested then the next semester in taking courses in world religions, or religious studies, generally speaking, within that
Mhm.
field. So I was a biology major, and at the time I thought I wanted to work with animals, and so
Mhm.
I was kind of interested in zoology, and maybe the hopes of going to graduate school for something related to that. And I took a course on introduction to world religions, in which we were learning about Eastern traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and those really piqued my interest. And so about the next semester, so about the second year of my undergraduate, I decided I wanted to learn Mandarin Chinese so that I could take a study abroad trip over to southern China. There was another university that partnered with mine, Zhongshan Dashui, or Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou, China. And so at that time, I was also competing in Taekwondo, and so I had
Wow.
a real affinity towards East Asian culture, martial arts, all that type of stuff. Now, Taekwondo is a Korean martial art, but obviously, martial arts, as we understand them, begin with Kung Fu, the Shaolin monks in China. So, um, I was a biology major. I decided to get a minor in religious studies, and then I began to study Chinese language for a year to get a scholarship to go to China. And I did that in 2011 and 2012. And about that time in 2011, I started to get into the use of psychedelics. So I became in contact with people like Alan Watts, Terence
Mhm.
McKenna, Robert Anton Wilson, Timothy Leary, and the psychedelic experiences I had on psilocybin mushrooms and LSD were quite eye-opening, and that fit very nicely with the sort of Eastern mystical spiritual angle. So went to China, realized that East Asia wasn't the sort of idealized
Mhm.
framework that I had from my classroom setting and learning languages.
Yeah.
And so it was a lot of fun. And I decided to go back again in 2012. But by that time, I had sort of transitioned my interest and became much more interested in religion, generally speaking, and the study of religion. And so I then became a double major in biology and religious studies and got an academic certificate, which is sort of like an associate's degree in Mandarin Chinese. And so that eventually led to me doing a capstone project on theories of ritual magic in religion. And I went to my master's program at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, where it was within religious studies. I kind of gave up on biology and just continued to my pursuit in regards to religion and theology, generally speaking, but I certainly wasn't a practitioner of any one religion. It was more of a
Mm-hmm.
perennialistic worldview where
Yeah.
I was in favor of the use of psychedelics. I thought Eastern mysticism had a lot of interesting ideas that I appreciated. And at that point, when I'd started my master's degree, I was very much interested in Hermeticism and saw
Mm-hmm.
Hermeticism as sort of this ancient wisdom that few people knew about, and was sort of like the true perennial core of religion, which is tied with all these theories about who Hermes Trismegistus was and so on.
Mm.
So my master's degree was focused on early Christianity. I was studying Koine Greek and psychedelic shamanism. So the two professors I worked with was the early Christian history professor and then the Native Americans tradition professor. And um, doing that for 2 years, I kind of got disenchanted with historical scholarship or textual scholarship because it seemed kind of mundane that my professors would spend a lifetime learning various languages, reading ancient texts, reading some of the Nag Hammadi Gospels, so the 48 Gnostic
Mm-hmm.
Gospels that are outside the canonical scripture,
Yeah.
and thought, man, I really don't want to do scholarship that's historical because these guys write works basically for other colleagues around the world, and nobody in the public sphere really engages with their stuff because it's sort of so highfalutin and academic. So
Mm.
that transitioned to me applying for PhD programs where I decided I wanted to be more in the field of new religious movements,
Mm-hmm.
and I was going to focus on people like myself who were spiritual but not religious. And my goal was to study why they appropriate various religious symbols, Buddhas, Ganesha, the elephant-headed god in Hinduism,
Yeah.
all this type of stuff, and to see and basically do a survey on people who are spiritual but not religious, which is part of a group called the Nuns, the NONEs,
Oh.
which when Pew Research Center does demographic research
Oh
on
yeah. Nice.
religion in America, the last option is none of the above.
Mm-hmm.
So you have like Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, all this different stuff, and then
Mm-hmm.
none of the above, which includes atheism, agnosticism, and then people who are spiritual but not religious, which the acronym is SBNRs. Um, that is actually the fastest growing religious demographic in the United States and is now the largest single religious demographic. If
Yeah.
you break up Protestantism from Catholicism, which the Pew Research Center does. So,
Mm-hmm.
from that perspective, I got accepted to a university called the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California,
Mm-hmm.
and it's sort of the graduate studies. UC Berkeley doesn't have a graduate programs for religion. All of that is allocated towards the Graduate Theological Union. So I went there, and during my first semester, I began to do research on a book called The Psychedelic Gospels by Dr. Jerry Brown and his wife, Julie Brown, where they began to find these various mushroom frescoes
Mm-hmm.
in places like Plain Corault, France, which is a church right here that depicts Adam and Eve with the mushrooms, and
Mm.
then they're covering themselves with the cap of mushrooms. This is a chapel that was built by the Knights Hospitallers. And then you have all these different frescoes, both in Germany, southern France, northern Italy, and also a few in Turkey. And his claim was that the original Eucharistic practice was tied potentially to the Eleusinian mysteries and these ancient mystery cults,
Mm-hmm.
and that it was a psychedelic inebriant. And this is how people had sort of mystical union with God, which at that time, I had a previous YouTube channel that I started during my
Mm-hmm.
master's degree, and that whole channel was promoting the use of psychedelics as sort of the leading edge of the religious experience,
Yeah.
presupposing that perennialism is true. So began to do that, and after a semester of doing research into that book and then various topics it discusses, I came to the conclusion that it's all tied to a Gnostic heresy that emerged during the Middle Ages,
Mm-hmm.
called the Cathars or Catharism.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, many scholars have noted that various crusading knights, both the Hospitallers and the Templars, were engaging in various Gnostic practices. Um, And so I came to the conclusion that it wasn't necessarily the original Eucharist per se, but it certainly was a psychedelic practice that was tied towards sort of Gnostic enlightenment.
Hmm.
And so from then, at that time, I had a Ukrainian girlfriend who was
Mm.
um, sort of culturally Orthodox. She just certainly didn't believe it in a significant sense, but we went to the Holy Virgin Cathedral there in San
Oh,
Francisco, where John of Shanghai's body is,
yeah,
and just seeing all the frescoes, seeing all the icons,
yeah.
seeing all the colors, I thought, wow, this is pretty interesting. And I bet, given my research, if I dive deeper into Eastern Orthodoxy, that I'm going to find more of these mushroom iconography.
Mm.
And that was given to R. Gordon Wasson, and his wife, Valentina Pavlovna, wrote a book called Mushrooms, Russia, and History, where they
Mm.
highlighted that Slavic languages and Slavic tribes have a long history of mushroom use. And so in English, they described it as sort of mushroom phobic, where uh, Slavic languages and maybe aspects of Italian are more mushroom philic in the sense that they have multiple words to describe various mushrooms and how to pick them. And it's very common for Russian grandmothers to take their grandchildren, particularly granddaughters, out into the woods and then identify these various mushrooms and what types of cuisine that they're a part of or
Yeah.
what they do. And so diving deeper into all that stuff, I eventually took a course on Eastern Orthodoxy, history and theology at the with a couple other PhD students,
Hmm.
and I was a non-believer, but that got me ingratiated into some of the patristic thought. Many of the 20th century theologians like Lasky
Hmm.
and Florovsky, um, as well as Bulgakov and these types of people. And so I was not a believer. I didn't believe in a literal Christ or the literal claims of Christianity.
Hmm.
But the more I studied Orthodoxy, the more I thought, wow, that's a really interesting worldview. And it's a much deeper, richer form of Christianity than I was ever aware of. And even though I was a doctoral student studying religion, I really didn't know that much about Orthodoxy in particular. So that eventually led me to reading more and more stuff. And the one that really kind of was a catalyst for my investigation into Orthodoxy was this book, The Cosmic Mystery of
Oh,
Jesus
yeah.
Christ by St. Maximus the Confessor. And then learning about the logos, the logi,
Hmm.
these sort of principles of creation, these logi, these sort of archetypal structures, and how they related to the logos, which was Christ, really sort of brought a coherent worldview into existence for me. That again, it was I struggled to give up the psychedelics and many of my presuppositions, but
Hmm.
at that time, you already had the Jordan Peterson phenomenon in 2017, 2018,
Yeah.
of course, the Trump election in 2016. So my worldview was certainly moving towards the right of center from where I initially was.
Hmm.
And listening to all of, again, Jordan Peterson was doing his Bible series then and looking at archetypal structures and logos theology of the Orthodox Church. By that next fall, so my last year during my course studies for my PhD program, I actually took a high dose LSD experience, and that confirmed to me that all the things that I really liked about sort of new age psychedelic spirituality, like sacred geometry, fractal mathematics, um, uh, really intense colors. Um, the idea that we're all unified. Of course, psychedelics would say that we are all one,
Hmm.
where orthodoxy says to love your neighbor as yourself,
Yeah.
both insinuating that there's sort of a universal category here, but one privileges a sort of understanding of personhood, where the other one is actually trying to
Hmm.
transcend the concept of the ego and the belief in a sort of single personhood that is made in the image of God. The realization is that you want to attain a sort of cosmic consciousness. So that led to me coming down from that and basically taking Christianity a little bit more
Yeah.
seriously and seeing that I felt it was actually a much more coherent worldview. And so
Hmm.
when I was looking at some of my presuppositions like perennialism, it didn't really make sense.
Hmm.
But through those investigations during that summer and into that fall, learning about Saint Justin Martyr and the concept of logos spermaticos and all this different stuff. Eventually, on the 11th of November in 2018, I made a prayer and basically gave my life to Christ and asked him to sort of lead me on a journey. And so that slowly led into a transition into going to Orthodox services,
Mhm.
becoming eventually an Orthodox Christian, and eventually creating a totally new YouTube channel,
Yeah.
and stop posting on the other one to promote Orthodoxy.
Wow. Amazing. Was there any barriers, like you commit your life to Christ, but then actually like going to church again, since it sounds like you were kind of like picking and choosing these different things to fit your presuppositions versus you kind of had that humbling, situation with God of committing your life to Christ, and then was it from there that it's just like, okay, I'm just going to accept what is handed down to me, or did you face any problems after?
No, it was, so I smoked weed probably every day from the age of 20 till, uh, the age of 30 when I became Orthodox,
Mm-hmm.
and so some of the difficulties were for me were not so much the intellectual stuff because I was already a bit of a head, and,
Yeah.
a lot of people who take psychedelics seriously, they're kind of heads too. They like to read, they like to
Yeah.
learn, they like ideas, and so that was very accommodating to me, but the practices of actually changing my life in accordance with an objective moral structure, that was probably the
Yeah.
most difficult. But after that experience and eventually giving my life to Christ, I began to pray more regularly
Mm-hmm.
in the evening, and I wasn't Orthodox Christian yet, so I wasn't partaking in any of the mysteries, but I
Mm-hmm.
did experience a sort of transition of just being more sensitive to some of the activities I was doing and
Yeah.
feeling that they were, more of a hindrance than a benefit, including my weed use, including the use of psychedelics, maybe watching pornography.
Mm-hmm.
These types of things became more of a feeling of a sort of detritus and a limiting of my own growth. And so, eventually I realized that, that next year, so one of the probably the most famous living philosopher is a gentleman named John Searle,
Mm-hmm.
and he is an analytic philosopher who had been a tenured professor at UC Berkeley since the '60s, and he did
Wow.
famous debates with Derrida and Foucault. And he's very critical, at least more of his more recent scholarship. He's very critical of the idea of a sentient AI,
Mm-hmm.
and so I was taking a course on uh, brain and mind, and then neuroscience and personhood with the same professor, and she's actually part of my dissertation committee. But I was able to meet John Cyril and stuff like that. And at that time, I think it was 2017, he was fired from UC Berkeley because he had, for the claims of sexual harassment, because he had asked a woman, a colleague there, to if she wanted to go to dinner with him.
No.
And so
Wow.
that really opened my eyes to the idea that these universities have total control
Mm-hmm.
over your basically intellectual work.
Yeah.
And it really confirmed that I didn't want to move into the university, which was a
Mm-hmm.
difficult realization because I had this dream of wearing tweed jackets and carrying a briefcase and telling the students when my office hours were and
Yeah.
sort of becoming that archetype of a university professor. But to see that that just wasn't gonna be feasible for me if I really wanted to speak what I believe to be true and
Yeah.
promote the ideas that I wanted to promote. So, that kind of really sent me for a loop trying to figure out what exactly I wanted to do because, as I mentioned, I had a previous YouTube channel, and so
Yeah.
while I was living in California, I was working at the registrar of the university, but then I was making the majority of my money through ad revenue from the promotion of these same gentlemen like Terrence McKenna, Alan
Yeah.
Watts, Timothy Leary, Robert Anton Wilson, Jason Silva is a popular one now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would take audios of them and then I would create graphics for people to watch that were very psychedelic. And I hated having to continue to make those videos. And at the same time, it's those videos that were giving me the ability to pay my rent and do all this different
Yeah.
stuff. So this coincided with the fact that the girl I was dating at the time was kind of off put, even though she was Ukrainian and,
Mm.
and an Orthodox Christian. she wasn't really interested in taking Orthodoxy as seriously as I was and reading
Hmm.
theology and all this different stuff. And from her perspective, she lived in an Orthodox country and she saw priests that were corrupt or that had affiliations with the local mob there or
Yeah.
that were lying about certain things that she knew about. And so she would go to Pascha and Christmas service, and that was about it.
Yeah.
And I was going deeper and deeper, not so much in the fact that there can be corrupt priests, of course there can, but the theology itself, the ideas, the paradigm, the structures. And so it eventually led to a point where she was not supportive of the idea that I was going to give up pursuing a university position and basically create a YouTube channel
Hmm.
that wasn't even tied to the one that I was already successful. By that
Yeah.
point, it probably had like 80, 90,000 subs. I was just on the brink to get to 100,000 when basically I shut it down and didn't
Yeah.
post content for almost 4 years. Um, and so uh, I ended up breaking up with her because she didn't really support where I was moving towards. And so um, I actually went to an ayahuasca ceremony
Huh.
in Joshua Tree, California
Mm.
during the summer of 2019. And I
Mm.
was kind of out of the psychedelics and I wasn't smoking as much as I used to do. But that was kind of the recourse that I had is when I was confused or lost, you sort of get inebriated and then you can have unique insights about what to do next.
Yeah.
And this is what I was going to do because I ended the relationship with my girlfriend. I um, decided I wasn't going to work at the university, which was sort of, I didn't know what I was going to do with my life.
Yeah.
And then at that time, my mom, she was having health problems. She kept getting weaker and she didn't really understand why she was. And it turned out she has a rare form of muscular dystrophy. So all that sort of happened at the same point. And then I decided to go to this ayahuasca ceremony and going to that, um, I took the ayahuasca that the shaman gave me, and it was this really weird experience. That was the first time that ever happened to me, where I got loaded on ayahuasca. The colors started coming, the
Hmm.
visualizations, and my experience was uh, two messages basically that Christ literally incarnated, and that was essential to have an actual judgment of humanity. And that my privilege was not so much that I was a white heterosexual male from the Midwest, but that I had very moral parents and
Yeah.
grandparents, and that morality is a sort of ripple effect that creates structure. And that then led to the next realization that Jesus Christ was a carpenter and that it was time for me to stop consuming drugs, consuming other people's ideas, consuming content. It was time for me to be a builder and
Wow.
to construct a new future. Okay, so this is a bit of an addendum to my conversation with Kyle because the following Sunday at liturgy, actually after I did this interview, it sort of dawned on me that I didn't complete the full context of my story. And it relates to the utilization of psychedelics, of which I want to be emphatic that I certainly do not support. Anybody familiar with my work knows that I don't support that. But in regards to this particular story about the utilization of ayahuasca and going to an ayahuasca ceremony, the part that I really wanted to state that I didn't give full context to is one of the most interesting things about that scenario is when I talked about Christ and I talked about my family. And then I talked about this sort of impetus to be like Christ, begin to build like Christ was a carpenter. It was time for me to build something new. And this led to me basically going full time with Church of the Eternal Logos. What I didn't mention is that for the first time in all those years of being pro psychedelic, Gnosticism, esoteric spirituality, Eastern mysticism, that the drug actually stopped working. And I kid you not. And so that day during the ayahuasca ceremony, once I got the sort of message that I felt was from God, and I do not believe that psychedelics connect you to God. My point and what I wanted to clarify is that I think that's how God needed to reach me because I was a very lost person. I was getting into orthodoxy. My aspects of my life were falling apart, didn't really know what to do. And so I turned to the utilization of an ayahuasca ceremony for clarity. And what happened and the clarity that I got was basically again the revelation of Jesus Christ, the reality of that, and me wanting to be like him and me needing to transition and move my life into a new direction. And so what was so fascinating is that the substances stopped working. Meanwhile, other people think they're leopards, they're crawling around on the floor, people are throwing up, the purging that happens when people take ayahuasca. I was seeing all these things, and yet for me, the drugs just totally stopped working. I remember going up to the shaman, I took another shot of the ayahuasca, nothing happened. Even the next night, on the second night, I remember taking the substances, being sober, taking them, and feeling like barely anything happened. I felt barely any difference in the sort of alteration of consciousness. And that was for me. And one of the reasons why I've never done those things again is because it was like God closing that chapter of my life. And so I just wanted to clarify, in no way do I think that psychedelics bring you to Jesus or bring you clear understandings about oneself or life. Can it happen? Yes, because one of the things that I talk about is that psychedelics, and something that even Timothy Leary discussed, they dissolve boundaries. And so this dissolution of boundaries are what the psychedelic substances do. And so if you have PTSD, and we see all the Johns Hopkins studies, but of course we know John Hopkins was wrong about the 2020 situation and certainly funded by the government. But anyways, I digress. But many of those peer-reviewed studies in regards to the utilization of psilocybin or things like MDMA for curing post-traumatic stress disorder. I know many ex-military people are now promoting this on YouTube. It's because they dissolve boundaries. And so if you have a phenomenological traumatic experience where there's an intense boundary there, yeah, I could see where these substances could help you dissolve that, move over it, move beyond it. But that's also why this sort of psychedelic spirituality is tied with really weird forms of sexuality, transgenderism, relative forms of morality and ethics, because it's totally dissolving boundaries. And so when we look at things like no border, no wall, no USA at all, the globalist agenda is about dissolving boundaries. And that's where I think psychedelics are part and parcel in that. And so even though I mention this experience on a high dose LSD trip that sort of really gets me interested in Orthodoxy after learning so much about it, and then having coming to some real sort of dead ends in my life and having to move in a new trajectory, I go to this ayahuasca ceremony. The drugs are not what helped me. God helped me, and God met me where I was, which was part and parcel the utilization of these substances. So I just want to clarify and add this addendum to anybody who's not familiar with my work. In no way whatsoever am I advocating for anybody to go to an ayahuasca ceremony or do high dose LSD trips by themselves. That was just where I was. And of course, God can meet us anywhere. And so yeah, I believe those substances open you up to a demonic realm, again, dissolving the boundaries between the noetic realm and the physical realm within space time. And so, certainly, many people contact demons. But for me, I think what was so weird is that for the first time ever taking drugs, I took drugs. I got a message, well, it felt to be a clear message about following Jesus Christ and reorienting my life. And then the drugs totally stopped working, even into the next day. So I just wanted to highlight that and give clarity to anything in regards to my conversation with Kyle in the utilization of psychedelics, that in no way am I promoting them. And for me, that's just where God needed to meet me in my journey with him and finding myself home in the Eastern Orthodox Church. So thank you for that little digression. And now back to the rest of the interview, the new future. And
Yeah.
so that's when I decided in September of 2019, and that was in the summer of 2019, that I was going to create 3 videos a week on a new YouTube channel called Church of the Eternal Logos, which obviously is not a church. I've been
Yeah.
accused multiple times that I'm trying to form a cult. So
Yeah.
just a play on Protestantism and promoting logos theology and
Hmm.
putting it in conversation with anything and everything that happens in culture or various topics. And so I took my life savings and I moved out of California and I moved back to Indiana with my parents. And I decided that I was going to make this work. And of course, even my parents were very skeptical that I was going to create a new YouTube channel
Yeah.
and make money, and I'm not going to do the professor stuff. And so um, I did that. I didn't make any money for 8 months. Basically depleted my life savings, and then eventually I started to grow, and that's what I've been doing ever since. So I'm now finishing my PhD, where my research topics have totally transitioned, and I now am trying to write my dissertation on apotheosis versus theosis,
Hmm.
looking at transhumanism and their attempts for sort of technological divinization and comparing that with the theology of orthodoxy and being deified through the uncreated energies of God,
Hmm.
which are two totally different structures. But that's now what I'm writing on. And so since that point, I've been making at least trying to put out 3 videos a week. Usually, eventually, it turned into like 20. Initially, it was like 20-minute videos
Yeah.
that were pre-recorded, and that led into eventually Jay Dyer and Jim Bob about a year into that saying, "Hey, man, you should do live streams." So
Hmm.
then I downloaded some software to do
Yeah.
live streams, and I did my first live stream with made by Jim Bob. Some people may know who that is,
Yeah.
and it took like an hour before we're able to fix the audio and all this
Yeah.
different stuff. And um, and ever since then, I've been doing live streams. And so I typically do a live stream on a variety of topics, and
Hmm.
those last anywhere between an hour and a half to 3 hours.
Yeah.
And I try to do that 3 times a week.
Yeah. And I think if you really, trust God and trust God's plan for you, I mean, I think you've had a lot of success. You've helped so many people with your videos because people need that like avenue to connect. And it may be movie analysis. It may be talking about a topic like the manosphere. It may be Eastern religions. But I think you speak to so many different people. So I think everyone's really grateful for your channel.
Well, I
Yeah.
appreciate that, man. And it is um, a leap of faith, and it wasn't what I like my life right now. I'm 34 years old,
Mhm.
and God willing, getting ready to finish my PhD in May. But my life isn't anywhere where I thought it would be at 34. I thought I would be working at a university. I'd have a house, maybe a nice car, maybe a girlfriend, and God luckily blessed me with a beautiful fiance who supports everything that I'm doing now.
Mhm.
But certainly, I feel like I don't have the monetary success that I would potentially have if I went in a different direction. But the providence and the work ethic that all men have to do, it's not just
Mhm.
me, but anybody, if you really want to be a tool for God, you have to work really hard.
Yes.
And so I'm very blessed at this point and very appreciative of the journey that God put me on, because now that entire journey that I just laid out leading up to the conversion to Orthodoxy, all those tools and all those books and all that reading now is beneficial for me to talk about it from a different perspective. And God willing, He uses it and it benefits other people that listen.
Yeah. It definitely does. And one thing I wanted to touch on that I heard on your original video on your spiritual journey was
Mhm.
like you were studying all these things, but actually kind of seeing them in practice, like the fruits of these ideologies was like a big like revelation to you. Like actually going to China and seeing that everyone's actually really materialistic, like it's nothing like all this philosophy. Going to Berkeley and it's like, they love learning about all these different cultures. And I think, you and I and like a lot of my friends, like we love learning about different cultures and different things, and we're like genuinely interested. But it's like it's not like they don't actually practice that. In a place like Berkeley, like they talk about tolerance and all these things, but unless it's European people, Christians, there is definitely a bias in seeing the fruits of these ideologies and where they actually lead. I think is a huge testimony to like what it actually is, like the fruits of the tree.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, when I went to China, I was very much interested in Chinese culture. I knew about Chinese history, I knew about the different dynasties. And when I got there, my interest in going to a Buddhist temple or a Taoist temple, I quickly realized that the Chinese students that I was engaging with and the Chinese culture I was immersed in Guangzhou was very capitalistic. So even though we still call the CCP communist, and then they are,
Hmm.
but it's a hybrid form of
Yeah.
communism that is very hyper capitalistic. And um, seeing that really altered my perspective. And that's why from the first year to the second year of going to China, the second year I knew that I was doing it more for fun and I wasn't discovering what I was going to
Mm.
do academically. But when I went to Berkeley, California, I had been living in Indiana and then Illinois. And so, me promoting all these psychedelics and new age, spiritual but not religious spirituality, I was kind of more on the progressive side than some of the
Hmm.
other students. And then I get to Berkeley, California, and I see the homelessness.
Yeah.
I see, uh, radical forms of sexual expression. There was a protest, the famous protest in Berkeley, where Ben Shapiro and uh, uh, Milo
Yeah.
Yiannopoulos was getting ready to speak, and that a Berkeley professor actually beat a kid in the head with a bike lock,
Oh no.
who was, and those charges were dismissed. That was right when I moved to Berkeley,
Oh wow.
California, and so there were protests, and then later there were protests in form of the Pride celebration, which I saw things that I was astonished by, and then to see that other students and even professors were promoting minor attracted persons.
Okay.
This was in 2017. Really opened my eyes to the idea that some of the stuff I was promoting, I was still sort of rooted in my, Midwestern Christian ethics that were
Mhm.
sort of I was swimming in but wasn't aware of. And
Yeah.
so then I go to Berkeley where they're explicitly trying to transgress those things, and I could feel that it was kind of disgusting and I didn't support it at all. And so I was like in this weird place where I was making considerable amount of money promoting psychedelics. I myself was spiritual, not religious, yet then I have a cultural milieu around me where people are performing things. I mean, um, sexual indecency you can see on the sidewalk,
Yeah.
fecal matter when you go to when I went to San Francisco,
Hmm.
needles everywhere, homeless people everywhere, crime. And I'm like, where exactly is the endpoint to these sort of progressive ideas? And so, like I said, that was right around the time of Trump and Jordan Peterson. And
Yeah.
so, um, I was kind of beginning to move towards that direction, and I even felt animosity towards myself within the other PhD students because I was critical of some of their ideas. We would have these group discussions in various classes, and there would be reading topics. We would read various theorists, whether it be sociology or psychology or whatever it may be, approaches to the study of religion, and looking at their theoretical frameworks they use to write scholarship. And then I thought that was very interesting. I love that. And then we would come into a group setting, and then we would like share ideas and do stuff like that. And I would be critical of some of the other students because they would say hogwash. They would say stuff that just didn't make any sense. And I had to meet with some of the advisors and one of the higher ups to say that it was inappropriate for me to criticize people's ideas.
Well,
And I had to be conscious of the fact that I was a white heterosexual
uh,
man and that I had privilege, and that me criticizing, whoever, a foreign student or a woman in the classroom, that this wasn't condoned and I needed to tone it down. And so that really opened my eyes to the idea that academia itself isn't really about truth. It's not really about the pursuit of truth and various ideas. It's now a sort of participation trophy setting where everybody is right, everybody gets to voice their opinion, and any sort of public or vocal criticism is not condoned. So all that sort of coagulated into me realizing that, man, I do not want to be here. And feeling, again, persecuted myself just based on immutable characteristics.
mhm.
I realized that one, China wasn't what I thought it was when I went there.
Yeah.
Berkeley wasn't what I thought it was, and the academia at the highest level wasn't what I thought it was. And so all those were catalysts into sort of me trying to figure out how can I take my passion for reading and researching and build an actual business for myself.
Yeah. And it must have been so hard to see that academia was that way, since you wanted to join it so much. But it really is. We have like this naive way of thinking of the world that, oh, they're the adults, like they're gonna treat like everyone fairly. But it's like, no, this world is fallen. And seeing that the way that people act, these different power structures, and it's not really about truth. I mean, they don't care about you actually bringing up questions, but just enforcing certain beliefs on you while preaching the opposite, preaching
Right.
tolerance. So I think that's especially 2016 and after, like it was really like a wake up, like this is an illusion, this isn't reality. There is like it's really it was like a spiritual experience, like those few years and on, I think, waking up a lot of people.
Well, that's why I promote young men to be active, right? So a
Yeah.
lot of the stuff that we're talking about um, is because I took whatever I believed and then I was proactive in the world. I'm going to go to China, which
Yeah.
again, at that time, nobody in my family, they had gone to Europe a few times, like in the 80s. But I was sort of a anomaly in my family and even my extended family, and the fact that I was so willing to go to the other side of the planet
Yeah.
to learn Chinese, to put myself in places where I was totally dependent on my facility for Mandarin because nobody spoke English. I took train rides with another gentleman where we went from southern China to Beijing and stayed there for a week, where just totally independent of
Yeah.
anybody being able to help me in any way. And I think that is huge. Again, it's providential in the sense that by putting yourself out in the world and going and doing stuff, including going to Berkeley or pursuing a PhD, all that stuff takes effort. But it's like God can work with that. If
Mhm.
you stand in one spot, or everything is just reading, or everything is
Yeah.
just you in a room, um, God can't work with that to the same degree. And I'm not saying that it was providentially beneficial for God's ultimate purpose that I go to China or Berkeley or anything. Of course
Yeah.
not. But for me in my life, those realizations and the course correction of my life, it was necessary for me to actually engage in the world and
Yeah.
go and do things.
Exactly. That's what I. It's so good that we're giving advice to, like, actually go work out, actually go to your local church, like actually form a community. These are so important to get out of your comfort zone and
Right.
not just be like hyper online. Like, especially with Orthodoxy, it's something that needs to be experienced in person.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I would say that's one of the biggest. Now, I think online orthodoxy, generally speaking, is great.
Yeah.
And I think, especially when you look at YouTube and like online apologetics, I would say orthodoxy is top tier
Yeah.
compared to Protestantism and even Catholicism, despite us being less than 1% of the US population. But, I personally am not a big fan of how Ortho Twitter works.
Yeah.
And these guys that are. Uh, I'm all for defending the faith, and I'm all
Yeah.
for correct theology, absolutely. But I personally have met so many people that their lives, their personal lives, um, there's a lot to be worked on. We'll just put it that way.
Exactly.
And their outlet is basically taking the truth and validity of orthodoxy as a baton and beat people with it. And that is not a characteristic that I think is beneficial for gaining converts or one's life in general. And so many of these people I've seen, they do that for 2 years and now all of a sudden they're into something else, or they
Yeah.
transition because uh, the Orthodox life is about participation. And so if you're not going to church, for example, there's a guy that I knew, he's now a Muslim. His name's, well, he has a YouTube channel called Bobby's Perspective. And I had been in contact with him, and he had this Orthodox brand and claimed that he was an Orthodox Christian and all this different stuff. And then turns out he wasn't even going to church. And this is why he was susceptible then to becoming a Muslim, because the Trinity is polytheism, and
Hmm.
we use icons and we kiss the hand of the priest and we believe in the Theotokos. And so I'm not saying Bobby in any way is indicative of all of online orthodoxy,
Hmm.
but in regards to Ortho Twitter, there's sort of a hyper vigilance towards debating the most minute things with people,
Yeah.
when in regards to actually building themselves up to be great men, which I think is our goal in Christ,
Yes.
is left wanting. And it's like, well, I think we would get more converts if Orthodox men, to use the colloquium of the kids nowadays, if we were like
Yeah.
Orthodox Chads, if you will, in that we
Yeah.
were actually doing things and we were actually becoming men that women wanted to marry,
Yeah.
and building ourselves in whatever business it is. Maybe you're a plumber, maybe you're a construction worker, maybe you're an artist,
Yeah.
but just becoming overly competent and using our faith as the reason why we are putting so much effort into working. I think that would, one, differentiate us from most of Christendom, but it would be so beneficial and would make us a rival to why all these men are wanting to become Muslim after the Andrew Tate phenomenon and stuff like that.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, being chronically online is literally the worst thing for your mind, body, soul. Like we need to actually be doing things. And it's like people don't know how to like choose their battles. Like getting on these random Twitter battles, like they don't lead anywhere, and there's such a lack of like love and humility in it. And so it's, yeah, I think it's really important that people, like, the internet is a great tool, but in its proper place.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So my next question is, how would you go about refuting the Eastern religions? I mean, there is a lot of them. Is there like a general overarching errors of them with, like Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism? Because there are some similarities that, at least my perception is, there's kind of like a incoherent metaphysics, maybe a little bit of a Gnostic view of like our desires and nature, and they embrace reincarnation. So we have, lots of chances. So how would you go about, the general problem with the religions, and then maybe the more specific problems with each one?
Well, I would say in a way, Taoism, Hinduism, and Buddhism are, in a way, three different paradigms.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, beginning with the older one, Hinduism,
Mm-hmm.
it is polytheistic. Some would say it's monotheistic in regards to the ultimate overarching presence of Brahma. But um, it is a belief in the soul, which is going to be a differentiation with Buddhism. That was what Siddhartha Gautama was really noted for, is that he believed that the world was all suffering, that desire led to suffering. This is part of the Four Noble Truths and then the Eightfold Path, is that you have to eliminate your desire, realize that there is no soul, that what we believe the soul to be is the collection of negative karma. And this is why then you are presently in the lifetime that you are, and that enlightenment was offered to anybody in this life. This was very different from Hinduism, which had a strict caste system, which was much more ritualistic in a sense of the way that the Vedas, the Rig Veda, then moving into the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, much more philosophical texts. But these are later developments in the history of Hinduism. And so Hinduism believes in a soul, and that we then can become enlightened and attain moksha. Moksha is released from the cycle of samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth, of reincarnation. And that if you were born a woman, for example, now this is changed in some aspects of Hinduism, but historically, then this wasn't your lifetime to attain enlightenment. That there's a general expectation where it's a man, usually he would have a family, and once the children went off to educate, university, I mean, even though that's not historical necessarily, but they got a job. Basically, the children were able to have their own families. Then the head householder, he could then become an ascetic and renounce the world, renounce his family, renounces his belongings, and then he can move on the path towards enlightenment. So Hinduism is a really just a collection of different worldviews, and sort of venerative practices. So
Mm-hmm.
you have Shaivism of people who believe Shiva is the ultimate god,
Mm-hmm.
people that believe Vishnu is the ultimate god, Vaishnavism. You have all, Shaktism, that Shakti is the ultimate god. And so you have all these devotional cults in Hinduism, and what they believe can certainly differ. They have, the right hand path and the left handed path, which is considered the tantric tradition. So
Mm-hmm.
when we look at a deity like Kali, which is a female goddess, which is the tantric version of Shiva's wife, where she now becomes a sort of dominant aggressor. She has a garland of male heads. She stands on top of her chest. Or the chest of her husband. She's getting ready to kill him. And so it's like this veneration of unconstrained female energy. And it has a very erotic and sexual
Mm-hmm.
bent to it. And I've even did a quick video comparing Kali to forms of Western feminism. But
Yeah.
I digress there. My point being that Hinduism is, I would say, very different from Taoism.
Yeah.
Buddhism, and the Buddha himself has been appropriated by forms of Hinduism. So they have devotional cults within Hinduism that like venerate the Buddha. But Buddhism itself, you have Theravada, Mahayana, and then um, Vitrayana, which is the Tibetan form, and that's the more mystical form, and they believe in deities. So
Hmm.
that's where there are a lot of nuance has to be used when talking about Buddhism or Eastern traditions, because even within the schools of Buddhism, people will say, well, Buddhism is an atheistic tradition. Well, true, if you're especially talking about like Zen Buddhism in Japan or stuff like that.
Hmm.
But if you get into Tibet, that is very much believes in various gods and deities that they perform rituals to, and that can
Hmm.
help them attain various goals in the world. So, from an Orthodox perspective, Taoism is much closer to our
Hmm.
worldview. And in fact, I have the book right here, Christ the Eternal Tao by
Yeah.
Hiram Asassine, which talks about how
Yeah. Good.
Taoism, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So, how Taoism is sort of it's the closest you could get to a concept of logos in the world from naturalistic theology,
Yeah.
just from the pure observation of nature.
Yeah.
And so, Taoism believes in a heaven and in ways of hell. It believes that the Tao is uniting all things, that, again, the yin and yang, opposites, energies, these things are present within creation. So, myself, I was much more geared towards Taoism
Hmm.
and forms of Buddhism when I was very much interested in East Asian stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and so, the biggest, if you're going to critique those paradigms, you could critique in regards to the lack of a soul. And both Hinduism and Buddhism believe in Maya, that the physical world is a false representation.
Hmm.
It's an illusion. That's how Maya translates in the Sanskrit. So one could then ask them to, how do you come to ultimate knowledge claims if the world which you're observing itself is illusionary?
Yeah.
And so they would have to appeal to probably some type of personal revelation, for example, that of the Buddha, or the revelation of the Vedas. But typical Hinduism now is not Vedic oriented.
Hmm.
That was the Aryan form that sort of built the basis for what is Indian religion. But um, epistemology is a good one. Concepts of the soul, so
Hmm.
those are different depending on which tradition you're talking to, and just the overall cohesiveness of the worldview. I think that there's multiple holes one could poke through in regards from an Orthodox perspective, but
Hmm.
um, that often depends on who you're in conversation with, because most people don't even understand a transcendental argument or what you're talking about when you're talking about philosophical presuppositions.
Yeah, 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 exactly. Yeah, transcendental arguments, the impossibility of the contrary. If your worldview, you can never have knowledge because everything is an illusion, then your worldview is self-refuting. There's nowhere,
Exactly.
there's no,
It'd be like arguing for relativism and being emphatic that there is no
yeah,
objective truth when
ex-
you're trying to make a truth claim.
ex-
That doesn't make any sense.
exactly. And so, do you think there's any value in studying the Eastern religions? Is there anything that you saw that was correct in them? Obviously, there's a lot of errors that we talked about, but yeah, is there anything that you are they worth studying?
Um, I think it depends on who you are.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to do apologetics, then absolutely they're worth studying.
Mm-hmm.
And again, as an Orthodox Christian, there can still be truth found in these various traditions, because all truth is coming from a single epistemological framework,
Yeah.
being the Logos or Logos theology. That's what Justin Martyr was trying to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you're just an average Orthodox Christian and you're not really knowledgeable about the history of religions or stuff like that, I've seen too many people get confused and begin to appropriate incorrect ideas by
Yeah.
reading Eastern mysticism. Now, I myself find it beneficial, not from a spiritual standpoint, but when I'm criticizing various Western philosophies, or, Spinoza's pantheism, well, then you can find
Yeah.
correlates within Eastern mysticism and stuff like that. And that's beneficial for apologetics. That's beneficial for education. That's beneficial for those people that are on that level to see those ideas and recognize them. For the average person, I would say probably not.
Yeah.
Um, unless you've already really built your orthodox phronema, your mindset,
Mm-hmm.
your mentality, that you have your paradigm sort of set in stone, and then you can engage and learn and compare with other worldviews. So for me, yeah, I think reading Eastern mysticism, and I still get books. I got a stream. I got 2 sponsored streams. One here is on Sufism, and the other one is on a form of Buddhism. And then comparing that with Orthodoxy. So, do I think that's beneficial? Yeah. And will I read ideas in there that maybe I appreciate and can re-articulate in different ways for future streams or topics? Yeah. So it depends on who you are and where you're coming from. I think a lot of people get confused because they don't have, and it's not that you need formal training. I certainly don't promote the universities per se, but there is an importance to, having a sort of philosophical basis
Yeah.
when you read some of these stuff. Because if not, it's all going to start to bleed together, and you're not going to be able to understand that certain words, yeah, it's the same word, but it means something totally different in
Yeah.
a different context.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. The word concept fallacy is it happens all the time. It's really bad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it happens all the time. About every debate I've done, there's the word concept fallacy,
Yeah.
and that's where also I think Peterson, not that he's guilty of promoting it, but people who have overly Jungian or archetypal frameworks for reality, they do the exact same thing. So people, I recently was speaking with a guy who was like, yeah, but Christianity, you guys just worship the sun, and it's the same as Apollo and Mithra and all these different, classical deities. And it's like, well, just because you can find similarities between like belief in a virgin birth,
Yeah.
or the big one is, well, you guys worship Christmas on December 25th. Well, that's only true for the Western calendar. The Julian calendar, it was into early January, so that doesn't even make sense. But the word concept fallacy also influences why Protestants say, oh, well, you guys appropriated, pagans did X, Y, Z, and
Yeah.
well, that doesn't mean something is incorrect or something is false. That's just a failure to have a logical framework to understand how to perceive and decipher information.
Yeah. Exactly. And so it sounds like logos theology was very important in your conversion, and especially how it contrasts to these different religions. And the word logos, do you want to explain that for people who don't know, and like how important it is?
Sure.
Yeah.
So logos is a Greek word that is the first written account begins with Heraclitus. And so Heraclitus is um, famous for saying, like, you never step in the same river twice. So in regards to ontology and the debates at that time in regards to the nature of being, he believed being wasn't static, but it was constantly moving. And he believed that what connected and sort of concealed this entire moving state of reality was the logos, and that the logos united opposites. The logos was the basis for numbers, and the logos was the basis for reason and logic, of which most people don't realize logic and reason are 2 different things. Reason is your capacity to be rational. Logic are things that are out in the world. These are logical fallacies, the law of identity. These things are not inside your head, although once we get to the Enlightenment with Kant, he's going to argue that they are. But that's one that I've talked with many people, even Orthodox or Christians, and they don't fully understand the difference between logic and reason. But Heraclitus made that point about the logos, and the logos was then a very central point of Greek philosophy. Even for Plato, then, he believed in the ideal forms. He had a sort of a priori to deductive form of philosophy, which was contrasted with his student Aristotle, which was inductive to deductive. So Aristotle was much more interested in what he could see and touch, and then coming to deductive inferences from those bits of information, as opposed to Plato. He began with the idea of ideal forms. So the chair I'm sitting in is less real than the ideal form of the chair itself. Because if all the chairs were abolished on the planet, as long as we still had the ideal form, we could create another chair. So Plato then rooted all these archetypes, all these ideal forms in his sort of demiurgic logos, that the logos was created. Some people say Plato believed in a god. He uses the term the good with a capital G sometimes in the translation. Obviously, it's in Greek, but whatever he perceived to be as the ultimate entity, it was sort of non-personal. and it then gave rise to the first created thing, which was the logos. And this logos then is how we then participate as rational entities, participate in these ideal forms. This was further developed then by Stoicism, where the Stoics took that sort of Platonic framework and then added that the logos was all of nature, and that nature was sort of organized by the logos, and that the point of the Stoic then was to live a virtuous life,
Hmm.
because it was by virtue that they aligned themselves with the logos. And we can see how these ideas are, as an Orthodox Christian, a progressive revelation towards who Jesus Christ is,
Yeah.
because we can see all these sort of match up with when St. John writes in the Gospel of John, in arche in ho logos, in the beginning was often translated the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, we're now making a claim that the logos is not a created entity. The logos is uncreated. Theological language is begotten, but that the logos is the source of archetypes, a la the logi, the divine principles of creation. Saint Maximus the Confessor, the logos is about that which organizes nature, that which is
Mhm.
the housing of sacred geometrical structures and fractal mathematics and all number theory and all this
Yeah.
different stuff. But the way in which we do align with the logos is through our morality. So again, we can see that Stoic influence, and it's not that, oh, it's wrong, you guys are just building upon Greek philosophy and
Mhm.
Stoicism. That's stupid.
Yeah.
We can see that aspects of these worldviews can have things right and at the same time be wrong. Like
Mhm.
Marcus Aurelius wasn't a great he wasn't very much in favor of the Christians, so he was a great Stoic emperor,
Mhm.
but he also persecuted Christians. So these aren't exactly the same worldviews, the same paradigms, but we can see the influence of this concept of logos, and why John, being inspired by the Holy Spirit, discussing and using the Greek language, what he's doing is combining the Hebraic prophetic tradition of the Messiah with this central concept of Greek philosophy as that thing which the Greeks have been talking about at an abstract philosophical level, and the Jews, the Hebrews, have been anticipating as an imminent person within space and time, come together in the person of Jesus Christ. And that is a unique claim, and that is very different from any sort of Platonic or Stoic philosophy or Neoplatonic philosophy, which is another subtle deviation, because the logos is still a demiurgic. It's the first concentric circle outside the one. But for us, then, this logos theology, this is what was so interesting to me, because I already had a philosophical background from my studies. And so
Mhm.
then reading the patristic theology, reading Basil and Saint Gregory Nazianzus, the
Mhm.
theologian,
Yeah.
reading Saint Gregory of Nyssa and Maximus, and then Palamas as a non-believer, I could put these things into their correct category. And what I saw was, wow, that makes so much more sense. That is so much more interesting. That is such a deeper understanding of who Christ is and
Yeah.
Christianity. And logos theology, then, what that's about is, one, built on the premise of personhood, that you and I are made in the image of God, and that's why we are able to participate
Mhm.
in these higher faculties that Plato would associate with, participation in the logos or something like that, or having the rational facility to understand archetypes. But um it's it's so much bigger. We are made in the image of God. We can directly engage with God through these uncreated energies. Theosis is the central point of the Orthodox life, which is a participation with God's will to become deified in an energetic synergy with God. Um, that I didn't have to give up, as I mentioned earlier, all these things that I liked about sort of New Age spirituality. I just had to sort of sanitize them and
Yes.
put them in the correct context within an Orthodox worldview, which gave voice to all this stuff.
Mhm.
It's very popular to talk about vibes and energies and stuff like that. Well,
Yeah.
that's totally consistent with an Orthodox worldview. The study of cymatics, and that um, words themselves are um, vibrations. And so we're taking auditory vibrations right now, and people who can speak English are in real time understanding it as concepts, mental images, words. And that is a real mystery in and of itself, that we can even do that. Now, according from a Christian perspective, that makes sense, because God created the world by speaking it into existence. And the logos is, in a way, the word of God. And
Mhm.
so we then have this privileged position where we can partake in these higher realities. And so, logos theology is a lot of things. I would characterize it by theosis, through personhood theology, through understanding the incarnation of God, the sanctification of the human person. Um, and then the theological part is then how are we saved through that process, and that is the participation in Jesus Christ as the incarnate God through the mysteries of the church, which he founded and is historically situated. I mean, that is a beautiful mystery, the fact that God would come and then create something that would be able to persist through space and time.
Yeah.
And that's what the church is. So when I talk about logos theology, there's a lot you could get into in the specifics there, but
Yeah.
what it's doing is bringing together the Greek and the Jewish mind and demonstrating that both of them were talking about the same person, but from two totally different perspectives.
Yeah. Wow, that was amazing, perfectly said. And I think so many like Protestants and people, they get a bad feeling from things like that. Oh, they think it's completely like pagan or it's completely Christian, but it's like these things, like we don't need to have a war against everything like in the world. We can make peace and acknowledge the good. Obviously we're going to criticize all of the bad and put it in its proper place, but a lot of these traditions and this terminology that we're using, like if Christ really is like the point of like all history, and we're supposed to have this and we're supposed to have this morality, it's going to be written on our heart. It should
Right.
be like we should see it in other cultures. It's not that they have the full truth, but we can acknowledge the good. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging like the things that they get right, because
Right.
yeah, I mean that's what the apostles did. I mean, we need to also speaking in the same language as these people, like using the word logos, like it helps us to understand like what this is all leading to.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, for those who aren't aware, the root word for the word logic comes from logos. So again, where exactly are these laws of logic rooted in? Well, they're rooted in the logos,
Yeah.
which is part of people who might be familiar with my content, or Jay Dyer or Father Deacon Dr. Ananias, using the transcendental argument for God
Yeah.
is looking at and highlighting these particular instances. So, but you were mentioning, um, I think I'm losing my. There's something there that I wanted to speak. You were talking about, the black and whiteness
Yeah.
of how a lot of people, and this is just an inability to actually critically think. And this is part of why, political dialectics, the problem, reaction, solution,
Hmm.
if you're not able to hold two things in your mind, Aristotle talked about this, that one of the signs of an educated man is that he can hold two opposing ideas in his mind at the same time. And unfortunately, so many people, and I recently was talking about this in regards to transhumanism and the influence of technology, that documentaries like The Social Dilemma have highlighted that the utilization of social media and the obsession by particularly the younger generation, Gen Z, that it is moving their majority of their brain activity further down their brain stem. And so because they're addicted to dopamine hits, they actually can't think. They actually can't critically think for long periods of time. And this is part of how social media is engineered to control us
Yeah.
through dopamine hits, arguing with people, this type of thing. And it can be beneficial at certain points. Again,
Yeah.
everything has a right
Yeah.
context. So it's
Yeah.
like the problem is black and white thinking. And that if you're actually going to critically engage in something, there's a lot of gray area there. And that's the nuance that people just don't participate in. And that's how they're so manipulated, whether it be American
Yeah.
culture or world politics. It's by creating these sort of false dialectics and then people be emotionally responding through propaganda that they're actually being controlled and they don't even realize it.
Yeah, exactly. It's really there's a war going on for our mind, and
Yeah.
yeah, that was perfectly said. So my last question for you, I have lots more questions, but I don't want to take up too much time. We can do more streams. But what are your future goals for yourself, for your channel? I'm really excited about the future of your channel. I feel like the Orthodox community, like we're all growing together, and that's why I feel like we have such a great community. You're right, like the level of Orthodox apologetics is just so much deeper than anything else. And I feel like I've been able to like fill a niche of the shorter form content, but it's really, I want to point to people like you, people like Jay, people like Father Deacon and David, because it's just we have such a great community here. So what are your personal goals?
My personal plan. So, I'm engaged to a beautiful Orthodox woman that I am hoping to get married in the year 2024. In regards to my business, I'm trying to finish up my PhD. My goal, God willing, is to finish the dissertation and be able to defend it by May of 2024. So finishing the PhD is like one of the number one goals I have in my life, because I will be able to turn that dissertation into my own book, which will be it will be very academic, so it's not going to be like a popular book. I don't expect it to be a bestseller, but it's
Mm-hmm.
going to lay out the history of transhumanist ideas, the modern day humanist philosophy, and then what is logos theology of the Orthodox Church, and then how these compare and contrast in regards to forms of divinization. And so I hope to be a voice within Christianity, generally speaking, not just the Orthodox world,
Yeah.
to really be an expert on transhumanism. Unfortunately, it's not a very popular topic. So those who are aware of it
Yeah.
find it very interesting and very worrisome, but it's probably some of the least popular content that I make. If I do something that's about pop culture or something, you'll get, twice the amount of views than
Yeah.
if I do a real deep expose on like extropian philosophy, which is the philosophical core of transhumanism.
Yeah.
But anyways, I plan on producing a lot of content related to my research
Mm-hmm.
until I can finish this PhD, and then, God willing, be able to turn that into my book. And for the business, I have a lot of things I'd like to do. Once I can finish my PhD, I'd like to create courses on my website. So one of the things that I'd really like to do is create various basically like semesters worth of information. Obviously, you're not going to be accredited. You're not going to get any sort of university
Yeah.
credit, but those that trust me and trust the information I put out, basically I can create full semester length courses on introduction to world religions, new religious movements, the history of Western esoteric traditions, um, Orthodox theology, church history, um, religion in America. And so these would be like 10 to 12, maybe hour to 2 hour long videos. And then people could go and they could purchase the whole semester worth of videos, or they could do sort of a la carte and choose
Yeah.
which ones from each course that they like. And that would create a new business and revenue stream that I can utilize my research, utilize my expertise, continue to grow. Um, if the opportunity emerges, I plan on to potentially engage with some of the manosphere stuff. There was talks of potentially going on the Whatever
Ooh.
podcast, which is
Yeah.
it's it's certainly in a way degenerate and
Yeah.
promotes, even though it's critical of OnlyFans girls, they go there and then they promote their OnlyFans.
Yeah.
But um, whatever I can do to sort of build a newer audience,
Yeah.
because my problem in regards to building a serious business that can take care of my family is the majority of my audience are Orthodox.
Yeah.
And even though it's really good when you build a channel to have a niche community, I
Yeah.
mean, that's kind of the way that online businesses work now, is to find niches.
Yeah.
Um, it's it's not as beneficial as having aspects of a general audience. So I already built my core audience. My
Yeah.
core audience are mostly men that have families, guys that are younger, guys that are serious about their faith, and as the kids say, based and red pilled.
Yeah.
But I really want to start trying to find ways in which I can engage more people who would be sympathetic to ideas I have, but certainly not Orthodox or familiar with any of that stuff.
Yeah.
So, doing manosphere stuff, doing fitness content. So, God willing, once my fiance gets here and we're able to get married in the U.S., creating like how-to videos of bodybuilding,
Yeah.
how to grow muscles, how to work various muscles and develop them. And so I would love to begin to create more fitness content and showing again guys how to build their body, which isn't exactly orthodox, but I've been in talks with like Father Moses McPherson and Father Michael Butler.
Hmm.
Father Michael was bodybuilder, and then Father Moses is a very high level power lifter. And so demonstrating and trying to show people that these are ways in which you can express your spirituality and your faith in God, that it's not superficial to work out. It's superficial if you're constantly posting, six-pack photos in the
Yeah.
mirror at the gym, but becoming and developing a sort of physical presence as a man is essential if you're going to be a provider and a protector of your family.
Yeah.
So I think Father Moses and I want to do a sort of free symposium potentially on the last Sunday before Lent, where men and women, whoever they are, can join a very large Zoom meeting. Hopefully, with Father Michael Butler will join us, and we can talk about how exactly do you work out and build muscle during fasting periods.
Yeah.
So, um, so doing stuff like that, but really, my number one focus as of right now is trying to knock out this PhD because it
Yeah.
will free me to actually speak uh, more freely online, just because I am conscious of how the academic structure is, and I don't want to do anything that could potentially
Yeah.
be detrimental when I'm so close to finishing
Yeah.
a decade of work that I've been developing. So that's really the main goals is finish this PhD, and then I have so many ideas of how I could grow my business once I'd have more
Yeah.
time to do that, and then just sit and read and do research, man. That's what I love to do.
Yeah. I think it's really only a matter of time. Like we have like Orthodoxy is such a gem and it's hidden for no reason, and this community that we have is such a gem. Like it's just getting like people just need to be the awareness needs to be spread, because like once they hear this, like once they hear you, Jay, like me, it clicks. It makes sense. This is it has like truth. It has the full truth, while these other more popular things online, they've got these partial truths. Like we have the full truth. Like on the whatever podcast, like yeah, they're right about some things, but they ultimately don't have the right paradigm. It's still for their own
Right.
like hedonism without God. But we like once people hear it, it's just this is it. But yeah, I think this
Yeah,
is
I totally agree.
yeah,
I think Orthodoxy is only going to grow,
yeah,
and the prophecy by Saint Paisios is that the Orthodox Church is going to enter a golden era in regards to its growth before we really reach the end times. And
yeah,
so, somebody like Father Peter Heers, who I'm close with and friends with, he believes that we haven't hit that yet.
yeah,
So, potentially, what we're seeing in the West and the growth of Orthodoxy is going to be the beginning of maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's a decade, but in a way, Orthodoxy is going to have its opportunity to sort of spread back around the world.
yeah,
Orthodoxy was one of the last religions to really get to the U.S. Even
yeah,
though, yes, I'm aware of Saint Augustine, Florida, has the Greek chapel there,
hmm,
the Orthodox chapel, but generally speaking, it wasn't until the Russians came through Alaska that Orthodoxy really took any root in the United States. And we already had Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists here.
yeah,
So I think, hopefully, God willing, that we can be good representatives, that we can represent what it is that our values teach us, embody those, and that Orthodoxy can spread and hopefully get more people to be resistant to the troubles that are certainly going to come in the future.
yeah. Awesome, amen. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Thank you so much for your time. God bless.
Thanks for having me. God bless.